Welcome to the third episode of Capture Q. Today's guest is Ian Young. Ian has been a journalist for more than 20 years. He's worked for Australian newspapers and he worked at the London Evening Standard. In 1997, he moved to Hong Kong, where he shared awards for excellence in investigative journalism and human rights reporting. Today, he is a Vancouver correspondent for the South China Morning Post. Most prominently, he's been covering the Meng Wanzhou extradition hearing in Vancouver. In this episode, he gives us a brief outline of what that hearing is all about. But we also talk about his other notable reporting. In the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, Ian uncovered a policy that led to devastation in Chinese-Canadian care home facilities. He explains that story to me, but I highly recommend you check out his articles at the South China Morning Post. As always, we appreciate you listening. If you enjoyed the show today, you can find others by subscribing to us on your favorite podcast provider or by following us on social media. Thank you so much and enjoy the show. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tracy. It's great to be here.
Let's just start with your background. If you want to walk us through, what got you here today. I know you've been with, other news organizations. If you want to briefly talk about that.
Yeah, sure. I started out in journalism back in Australia, way back in the distant past, and I ended up leaving Australia in the 1990s. I ended up working in London on Fleet Street for a couple of years, and then I actually went out to Hong Kong in 1997 to cover the handover, which seems like an impossibly long time ago. And that turned into a job at the South China Morning Post, where I've basically been working on and off, for nearly 24 years. It's been quite an amazing experience. And the most recent part of that has involved me resettling here in Vancouver, where my wife is originally from. And I've been the SCMP's Vancouver correspondent since about 2013.
Yeah, so I guess we could do that. We could go into because you have done quite a few investigations that are really interesting. We could start with, if you wanted, you're covering the Meng Wanzhou trial. You've been doing that for a while. I guess because my audience is quite general, do you want to give kind of an outline about, how that started, how it's going?
Yeah, sure. Look, the Meng Wanzhou extradition hearings have kind of consumed my life since December the 1st, 2018, which is when Meng Wanzhou was arrested at Vancouver's airport. And for the people who aren't exactly familiar with who she is, she's the chief financial officer for Huawei, which is one of the biggest tech firms in China and a real global player. So a globally important company. And not only is she the chief financial officer, she's the daughter of the company's founder. So she's a profoundly important figure. And so when she was arrested here in Vancouver at the behest of American authorities, that was an earthquake in Chinese relations with the West and with Canada and with the United States in particular. And so the battle over her fate, in many ways, it's a sort of a synthesis of the tensions that exist between China and the West and that have been emerging in recent years. It also puts us on the cutting edge of these sort of vast geopolitical changes that are really reshaping the world. It puts us in Vancouver at the pointy end of all of that stuff. We're under the spotlight for this global attention, for this really kind of a magnitude 9 story. Now, there's a lot of other issues have emerged since then that have pushed Meng Wanzhou's case onto the back burner for a lot of people. But I do think that that's going to re-emerge. And as what should be the final stages of the extradition hearing play out this year, that's going to be a profoundly important thing for, how China engages with the rest of the world and specifically how it engages with Canada.
So what specifically is she being charged with? I know she was the CFO. What are they specifically trying to extradite her for?
Yeah, well, she's not on trial here. She's they want her to face trial in the United States. And what's going on here is the extradition hearings, which will determine whether or not she gets sent to New York to face trial on fraud charges. Now, she is accused by the Americans of defrauding HSBC Bank by lying to the bank about Huawei's business dealings in Iran. and those business dealings were allegedly in breach of American sanctions. And what she's not been charged with is breaching American sanctions on Iran. She's been charged with fraud. But Meng Wanzhou's lawyers and her legal team have basically depicted this case as a dressed up attempt to charge her or to pursue her with breaching American sanctions, and that the so-called fraud charges actually represent an abusive process, and that she should be let go. That's the bottom line for the Chinese and for her lawyers, is that they want her to be released immediately. And this had a big impact outside the courts, obviously, because we've seen two Canadians, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, who were promptly arrested on espionage charges in China in the days after Meng was arrested. One was a former diplomat and one was a businessman who were engaged in China at the time. And as I said, they were charged with spying. They were put on very brief closed-door trials. So we don't know what happened at those trials. No verdicts have been released, but those trials lasted, for a couple of hours only.
Yeah, it's devastating, and a lot of Canadians, are obviously fighting for their release. You wrote a bit about how there was a Canadian lawyer told the judge to resist the exciting narrative of abuse. Do you want to talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, I mean, the Canadian government's point of view, or at least I should say, the Canadian government lawyers who are representing the American government's point of view, say that what Meng's team is trying to do is trying to play this out as a trial here in Canada. They say that the Meng Wanzhou's team is trying to depict this extradition case as a trial. And they say, no, this isn't a trial at all. This isn't to determine her guilt or innocence. This is simply to determine whether or not she should be sent to the United States to face trial to determine her guilt or innocence. And that was that quote that you cited came from Robert Frater, who is the Department of Justice's top lawyer. It's their top counsel for the government of Canada. So that indicates just how seriously the government is taking this, that they've got literally their top litigator on this case.
And there are some concerns about witness safety. Yeah, I guess if you want to, it just seems obvious, but if you want to talk a little bit about that, what are people concerned about, and who are they concerned about?
Yeah, well, this is actually a specific aspect of the case. There was an RCMP sergeant named Ben Chang, who was involved in the processes after Meng Wanzhou was arrested. Now, he also had communications with the FBI, and one of the aspects that Meng Wanzhou's lawyers want to hone in on is supposed misbehaviour that linked the treatment of Meng Wanzhou to improper dealings between the RCMP and the FBI. Basically, the RCMP and the border officers here at the airport were acting supposedly at the behest of the FBI. The problem is that Ben Chang doesn't live in Canada anymore. Ben Chang actually lives in Macau, where he's no longer works for the RCMP. He actually works as an executive for a casino in Macau. Now, he has refused to testify, much to the chagrin of Meng Wanzhou's lawyers. He has refused to come back to Canada to face this courtroom. And the reason has been very murky, but one document that I obtained says that the reason why he doesn't want to talk, or didn't want to talk to government lawyers, and why information was being redacted by the government lawyers, was on the grounds of witness safety, fears for the safety of Ben Chang, who, as I said, currently lives on Chinese soil.
Because he was an RCMP officer, and he had connections to Hong Kong. He was what was his role again?
Yeah, he was actually part of this sort of elite group who were RCMP liaison officers around the world, and he was based in Hong Kong for a number of years as an RCMP liaison officer. And I imagine that's where his connections that got him that job in Macau came from, because it's not an uncommon course for top police officers in Hong Kong to end up working in some capacity, generally as security, at Macau casinos. They're very well paid positions.
It does, and I know you haven't been covering this much lately, but it does kind of tie into what's happening in Vancouver. We have a lot of, I mean, obviously, so many news reports and you know a lot of stuff happening with our casinos and some corruption and some crime and trials and everything going on there. But yeah, let's talk about Huawei a bit. I know a lot of people very excited about the technology, their beautiful phones. What don't most Canadians know about that technology or about the company that you think would be important for us to know?
Well, I think the tensions that exist over Huawei relate to how its technologies are employed. We're not talking about handsets here. We're talking about the skeleton that forms the basis of the internet around the world, and we're talking about 5G technology and the way that that infrastructure is going to be created over the coming years, and that's going to be a real world-changing apparatus. What the concerns are here among intelligence folk and people who are worried about Huawei is that, to what extent does Huawei operate at the behest of the Chinese government? To what extent can Huawei be understood in the same way that a private company in the West is understood, as opposed to a large sort of, murkily founded conglomerate that operates under an authoritarian government? Does Huawei, at the end of the day, operate at the behest of the Chinese government? Huawei would say not, but to some extent, a big company like that does have to be very careful how it operates. It has to sort of, I can't, for instance, picture a situation where, if Beijing ordered Huawei quietly to do something, would Huawei resist? Is Huawei in a position to resist? Is any company within operating inside mainland China in a position to resist? And so those are the concerns. It's not just that Huawei is some company that makes phones. Yeah. In effect, Huawei is a company that makes the internet.
And there are criticisms, coming from that side about, the West and our corporations and all of the misdeeds and, things that have been going on and similar questions. Would you say no to Facebook, to Twitter? Should they ask for a favor from the government?
Sure. I think they're all valid questions. I think, though, that in the West, these matters should technically be dealt with under some form of transparency. You've got a relatively transparent rule of law here. National security matters notwithstanding, if Apple wants to resist an FBI request to access its information, it will go to court and do so. Yep. Or alternatively, the FBI will have to go to court and try to order Apple to do this. That's not going to happen in China. You're not going to have, the Chinese security apparatus going to court in China to try to require a company to do something. It just doesn't play out like that in China.
Yeah, which is the genuine concern. We could talk a little bit about just the differences. I mean, everybody's heard Trump say everything that he said about this technology and a few conspiracy theories, but also has concerns that Americans hold. Talk about the impacts of both the U.S. presidencies, Trump versus Biden, on this extradition.
Well, I mean, on Meng Wanzhou's case, the various interventions of Donald Trump had a profound impact on the case. It created the impression that this was a political persecution, that this was a political prosecution to further Donald Trump's trade war with China. And he basically said that himself. To the extent that you can understand what comes out of Donald Trump's mouth as the truth, or as what he even regards as the truth, or whatever happens to pass through his mind at any given time. He certainly did say that he would intervene in the case if he thought it would help America economically, if he thought it would help win the trade war with China. Now, that's a fairly shocking thing to say about a live case. It's a fairly, quite an amazing sort of intervention. And Meng Wanzhou's lawyers latched onto that, and they've used that as one of the platforms to argue that Meng Wanzhou, in fact, is facing an abusive process. And because of that abusive process, she should be her case should be thrown out, and she should be allowed to return to China.
So what's been happening, I guess, with this new administration under Biden?
Well, under the new administration, we haven't seen much change. I mean, we haven't seen, for instance, any moves to drop this case. But what we have had are rumblings that that there might be a deal, that there might be some sort of plea deal reached between the Americans and Meng Wanzhou that would, somehow result in her going home. That was reported by the Wall Street Journal. Now, I haven't seen anything out of that lately. I haven't seen any movement on that ground lately. And we are coming to the pointy end of the extradition hearing. We're coming up to the final stages. We were supposed to be in the final stages right now, in fact, but there was a new tranche of evidence that is being examined. But still, we're still on track to wrap this up, probably sometime in August after summer. But I haven't seen a huge shift in the way that the Biden administration is dealing with China. We've seen less eruptions. We've seen fewer of the kind of Trump-style verbal eruptions about China, and he's not tweeting anymore. But at the same time, these charges still exist, and the tensions with China aren't going to go away, I don't think.
Interesting. I guess we could move to, you've done, obviously, you covered what was happening in 2019 in Hong Kong. What happened then for people who didn't follow, or what are people in Hong Kong still wanting the West to know?
Well, what happened in 2019 were these extremely large-scale protests. Ostensibly, these protests were about a new law that would have allowed suspects to be extradited from Hong Kong into mainland China. And we saw millions of people on the street as a result of concern about that. And what that led to was a more general movement for political reform in Hong Kong, which was met by an overwhelming counteraction by the Hong Kong police, by the Hong Kong government, by the authorities in China to suppress that. And ultimately that led to the introduction of something called the National Security Law. And that was basically an expression of Chinese national security laws in Hong Kong. And that has served to greatly dampen the democratic aspirations of the Hong Kong people, unfortunately. I think we've seen the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement was really knocked over by that law, and that's something that's triggered concern around the world. And we saw counter protests and counter movements against this on the streets of Vancouver, because Vancouver, of course, is a very Chinese and very Hong Kong city. We've got a huge population of both mainland Chinese people and Hong Kong-born people and descendants of Hong Kong people in Vancouver, who are very, very heavily invested in the fate of Hong Kong. And that includes myself, for instance. I'm a Hong Kong permanent resident as well, as is my wife. And so we're very heavily invested in the fate of that city. And, and that's on a lot of people's minds right now, because we're approaching the June 4 anniversary this week, the anniversary of Tiananmen Square.
That's, it's a very difficult thing to watch, for sure. The Canadian census, I could have this wrong. There was a motion to say declare yourself a Hong Konger rather than a Chinese Canadian.
Yeah, something like that. This has become quite a big deal for Hong Kongers here. Is the expression of identity, because a lot of Hong Kongers feel that their specific identity is being erased or minimised because of the incursion of mainland Chinese identity and a more general Chinese identity. And so to that end, there was a campaign in the census to declare yourself to be not just a Chinese Canadian or ethnically Chinese, but to say that you were a Hong Konger and you're a Hong Kong Canadian. So it's something that emerged recently.
I want to talk a little bit about Sinophobia. You do see a lot of groups going around Vancouver saying that, of course, we want to address the horrific anti-Asian hate and violence. But what about the idea that you can criticize a government? I mean, I'm sure no American wants to be called a Trumper, that is against Donald Trump. Criticism of governments versus individuals and a culture.
Well, I think a lot of people who are in this arena are always concerned about not conflating criticism of the Chinese government and Chinese government actions, or Hong Kong government actions, or whatever, or Hong Kong or Chinese money flows, for instance, Chinese influence on the real estate playing field. Don't conflate that with anti-Chinese racism. That these are two different things, and you can be concerned about both. You can be concerned about unaffordability and Chinese money, and you can be concerned about the Chinese government, and you can be concerned about Hong Kong at the same time as being concerned about anti-Chinese racism and anti-Asian racism in general as well. So I think that there are some people who do try to conflate that, who do try to use, the overall banner of stopping Asian hate, which is a very laudable goal, to also suppress discussion about things like the role of Chinese money in the real estate market, or the role of the Chinese government, or scrutiny of Huawei, all those kind of things. And the Chinese government itself has been active in fomenting that kind of thing too. You've seen Chinese diplomats around the world have been using Stop Asian Hate as a cudgel against the West, and I think that most people who look at this closely sort of roll their eyes a bit when they see a Chinese diplomat, acting like a social justice warrior. But I think that, for a casual observer, some of that might sound reasonable. And, I think that's concerning to a lot of people.
Not wanting it to be used to quash dissent from people who have genuine concerns. I did see exactly what you're talking about on Steve Pike in TVO Ontario. A diplomat saying, when there's criticism of, the Uyghur population, pointing to, look at Canada's Indigenous population, or saying you guys are, hurting individuals based on, the anti-Asian hate and all of that. Diplomats saying
there's a very strong strain of whataboutism in the Chinese diplomatic corps at the moment. And, even with regarding things like the terrible discovery of up at Kamloops, the discovery of those 215 children who were buried there, that's been used repeatedly on social media by supporters of the Chinese government to say, well, whataboutism? What about? You can look at that, and what right do you have to complain about our human rights record? Which I think that's an incredibly long bow to draw, that you can be concerned about both of those things at the same time. The fact that this awful atrocity occurred doesn't preclude the possibility that other governments are also involved in awfully atrocious things.
When it's being used to deflect attention, which, makes sense that one would do that to put the attention off of themselves. I want to talk about, you did a series of investigative pieces on Vancouver care homes and COVID, and specifically there was a policy that caused delays in declaring an emergency, and we saw a lot of deaths as the result of that policy. Do you want to describe what that policy was?
This is a policy known as enhanced surveillance or enhanced monitoring, and the reason I became aware of this policy was I was closely scrutinising what happened at Little Mountain Place. And Little Mountain Place, for people who don't know, is a care home in East Vancouver, not far from where I live actually, where 41 elders died. 90% of the facility became infected, and most of those residents are ethnically Chinese, and that's one of the reasons why I was closely looking at it, because it's of interest to the community that I speak to. And it emerged that the outbreak there wasn't actually declared when the first staff member fell sick. So we had a staff member falling sick and testing positive to COVID, but the very next day, visits were allowed to continue, group activities, group meals and things like that were allowed to go on under this new strategy introduced in November, called enhanced surveillance. And the illness ran rampant through that facility. And so what I did is that I wanted to know to what extent was that policy also employed at other care homes in Vancouver. And it turned out that that policy of enhanced surveillance, of not declaring an outbreak when a staff member had tested positive to COVID-19, had been employed at 42 care homes that subsequently underwent full-blown outbreaks where 1,000 people were infected and almost 200 people died. So I thought that was quite a shocking thing, and that to find that out, I had to go through a rather intensive pursuit of the data under freedom of information laws, because certainly Vancouver Coastal Health was very reluctant to hand it over, and Fraser Health too wouldn't hand over this data without me filing those freedom of information requests. So it was quite an arduous process to get hold of that information, which I think was quite telling. I think that's would surprise a lot of people that outbreaks weren't being declared where staff had fallen sick. When staff had first fallen sick, people were allowed to continue with visits and group activities, etc. in many cases. And that, I think that did surprise a lot of people, and that sparked a lot of discussion.
Is it just protectionism? Is it they didn't want to admit
No, well, there was the reasons for the policy are complicated, and I think there are reasons. There are sound medical justifications for a policy like that, but at the same time, what Vancouver Coastal Health told me was that the reason they introduced this policy in November was to preserve staff resources, because they wouldn't otherwise be able to handle the outbreaks that were occurring elsewhere. And similarly, Dr. Bonnie Henry and others have said that the justification for enhanced surveillance was because they didn't want residents to suffer the deprivation of social interactions that that would be denied under outbreak status. So both of those things I think are very concerning, both of those justifications, and I think this policy will continue to get more scrutiny.
And that isn't really, I know so many people who were concerned just about their grandparents at the end of their lives being, locked into a room and not being able to socialize. And it does seem, how would you properly address, you've got two conflicting, concerns, which is, it's a tough place to be.
Sure, I think it's a question of how you prioritize it. But I think that the scale of the losses that occurred at care homes that employed enhanced surveillance, I think is eyebrow raising. The fact that we're talking about 1,000 people being infected, we're talking about 200 deaths. That's a significant portion of the second wave we're talking about here. And that's just the Vancouver care homes that I was scrutinising in particular. So while I think it's entirely valid to be concerned about the loss of social interaction for people who are put under outbreak status, should we not also be concerned about this vast loss of life that occurred in places that tried to preserve those social interactions?
So in doing this reporting, did you speak to a lot of people who had their relatives in these facilities?
Yeah, I mean, I focused very closely on relatives of people who died at Little Mountain Place, people who, were confused by this policy, who couldn't understand why outbreak strategies weren't put in place, why outbreak precautions weren't immediately put in place when they first detected COVID-19 among staff. I obtained leaked Zoom meetings between medical health officers and residents, in which the medical health officers basically admit that the outbreak was worsened by the fact that staff members continued to go to work even when they were showing COVID symptoms. because of this phenomenon called presenteeism, where they didn't want to let down the facility. They knew that they were already under strain. They knew that they were understaffed. So when they felt sick, they either deliberately or subconsciously downplayed their symptoms and kept going to work. And I think that also shocked a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. So since I mean it's been over a year, almost 2 years, well, a year and a half. Do you feel that we have, is there any movement to properly address? I mean, the main concern seems to be understaffing. Would there be any sense of training more people to deal with these care homes, or going forward, how do we prevent this?
What I would say is that, relatively, BC did pretty well. Relative to a lot of other places, BC did quite well, but that doesn't also preclude the possibility that mistakes and bad mistakes and life, mistakes that cause great loss of life also occurred. Those two things can be equally true. The seniors ombudswoman, Isabel Mackenzie, is going to conduct a review. There's going to be an investigation. Health Minister Adrian Dix has also said that he's going to investigate the process of enhanced surveillance. And so we'll see where that ends up. There have been concerns in the care industry about lack of testing and things like that, which I think would probably be quite specific to pandemic status. But, the whole situation of the pandemic has thrown a very unpleasant spotlight on the way that long-term care homes are run. And I think there will be a reckoning, and I think that, that's going to come, sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Does it bring up in your mind just the discussion of how we treat our elders in the West? Obviously there's a concern of people who don't have the finances, can't afford, really high quality care. Even the expensive care has its problems. Is there a discussion to be had here about how we treat our elders?
Well, yeah, I think there is. One of the reasons why I specifically got interested in this was because of the terrible loss at Little Mountain Place, which, as I said, was very heavily focused on the Chinese community and the Asian community. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a big debate, a big conversation that needs to be had about that. I mean, I think that it caught a lot of people unaware that these care homes were so vulnerable. And I'm not talking here just about residents and relatives and the lay public. I'm talking here about health authorities were set back on their heels when it emerged that care homes were the real hotbed for this disease and hotbed for transmission. That just raises a lot of questions, because we've had previous experience with this, with SARS and with various influenza outbreaks and things like that. So I think it did catch a lot of people unaware that the conditions were so ripe for such terrible losses at care homes. I don't think even people had even been thinking about that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It seems like an issue to be concerned about, but that wouldn't get big enough, and it did. So,
well, you hypothetical tragedies don't actually create headlines. I mean, that's the harsh way to say it, is that, it took a pandemic for people to be aware of these risks, to be aware of, the situation in care homes, and to wonder whether or not we were doing our best by our elders.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This conversation reminds me of, I was just trying to find it. Aeon magazine, they have a publication called Psych, and they do a lot of, obviously they talk about psychology. They have, a lot of philosophy on there, but there was an article, I'll send it to you. I was trying to find it, but just about the Chinese philosophy on mental health and on health. It knows that health is communal. Whereas the West, we have a lot of, very individual, and it's a fascinating read. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I don't want to weigh in too much about on the different philosophies and what might or might not have mitigated what happened here. But I would say, that care homes in Hong Kong, in other parts of Asia, East Asia in particular, haven't suffered anywhere near as bad as a set of outcomes as was suffered in the West, in the UK, in Canada, and in the United States. Is that a function of the way that elders are regarded? Is it a function of general pandemic awareness? Is it a function of specific policies? I don't know, but it's certainly quite a striking difference.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what, I guess, as we wrap up here, is there anything you're working on right now that you want to mention?
Well, I'm still working on care homes. I am still working on that. I still have an interest in how Hong Kong's place in the world will play out and how that plays out here in the streets of Vancouver. Because, as I said, Vancouver is so much a function of what happens in Hong Kong and so much a function of what happens in China. And of course, Meng Wanzhou, they're the big three stories that I've been working on for the past couple of years. And, I think I'll still be working on them for quite a while. Even Meng Wanzhou, even if the case is wrapped up this year, I can foresee appeals that drag on for much longer after that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, I really appreciate you coming to talk. I'm excited to get this up, and yeah, I appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
No problem, Tracy. Thank you very much for your time too.
Of course, and I'll be reading your articles, so, and following you on Twitter. I tried to log off Twitter and only focus on neuroscience. So I wasn't caught in all of the outrage of the day, but yeah, it's fascinating stuff. So.
All right. Thank you very much. It's great to talk to you, Tracy.
Of course. Bye, Ian.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.